I guess.
Good morning on a sunny Friday from Venice, which is a very different day than yesterday, which was a very cloudy and flooded Venice. That was the day when we were originally intended to gather, and I think it was probably more appropriate for the topic of the day. Sulayman, Ghaith, Anthony, and Ajmal have gathered in Venice, convening from various places in the world, in fact, very, very far off places in the world, but places that I think are very relevant to where we are and to the word that's meant to instigate a discussion between us. I'm opening the floor. I think that as an introduction would suffice. I'm opening the floor for the first intervention.
I tell you a story?
Yes.
Tell us a story.
I tell you a story. It's a story about a tribe of blind people living happily in their land. For them, the sky is yellow, the sea is black, trees are orange, the air also has a color. It's grey. One day, a stranger arrives amongst this tribe. The stranger is not blind. He has only one eye. The stranger sits down and talks to the people and says, people, I've noticed that you regard the sea as black and the sky as orange. Let me tell you, the sea is blue. The sea is sometimes green and the sky is blue. And amongst you are black people, brown people, white people, yellow people. This causes great confusion and mayhem amongst the tribe of the blind. So the elders gather and they grab hold of the man. They put their fingers on his face and they report back and they say, there's something moving. There's something moving in this man's forehead. So they take a stake and they pop his eye. And then nothing moves on the man's forehead. And everything returns to as it was.
And so ends the prophecy.
And so ends the story of the stranger.
So, what's the role of those who see things? Those who see things differently?
To disrupt. To disrupt, and I guess the meaning of that little parable is that to disrupt at great risk to one's sense of self, well-being. I mean, what I'm saying is that it seems to me that the prophecy begins with a disruption. A disruption of the status quo, a disruption of the structures of power. And if we take on structures of power, then immediately there is conflict.
There's also
danger.
But sometimes the prophecy is simply not necessarily aimed at power, but just aimed at otherness. They present another vision of things. Huh? And I guess it's of interest to think about, is it just the otherness that's shocking? Is that what's threatening? That one speaks of some otherness that's no one else can see? Is that what's really threatening, or is it really back to this power structure? Meaning, is that the consistent thing?
It seems to me that prophecy is always an extension, it's a radical critique.
as the beginning. And then it also has to propose something, an alternative that takes its place. So if we look at it as an awakening, prophecy as an awakening, and maybe that's where the story of the blind is quite interesting. There's also another story which follows the same logic, but doesn't necessarily talk about a disagreement. Well, it talks about a disagreement. It's the story, again, of a village of the blind, people that cannot see, whether that means that they're distant or detached from a reality, or whether they cannot agree on it. And in this village, in this uniformity of accepting that they cannot see, thus there is no contradiction, thus there is no difference, is a animal is brought into this village. And this animal is a great big animal. It makes a lot of noise. And the community of the village gather, and they pick 3 elders, and they ask the elders to go and explore, to go and find out, as a kind of reconnaissance, what is this thing that's been brought amongst our midst. So the 3 elders take their turns. The first one goes down, approaches this animal, and touches it and smells it and comes back and says, I've made up my mind. It's actually something which is very big. It's very stable. It's like a tree. It has the width of a trunk of a maple tree that has 300 years of age, and it doesn't move at all. So the second elder goes down, and they want to triangulate the information coming, so they won't believe one person. So it's a exploration by 3. And the second one goes down, and he also approaches the animal, touches the animal, feels the animal, smells the animal, and comes back and says, I completely disagree. The animal is actually very slender. It's very fragile, it's very flexible. It's nothing like a tree. And the people are confused, so they say, well, let's allow the third to go and make this assessment, and maybe the third one will get it right, or will there be some consensus between them. So the third approaches the animal, and he also touches it, he smells it, he feels it, he goes around it. And the part that he touches, he comes back and he reports, he says, neither is the animal as flexible as a snake, as flexible as you, or soft as you describe it, nor is it as solid as you describe it. It's actually very floppy. It's like the wind. There's aspects of it that have the feeling of the sail of a ship. And so these 3 men disagree, and by the nature of their disagreement, the community is left no further or no better than they were before. And in fact, the animal they were talking about was an elephant, and they had all approached a different aspect of this elephant. So their combined stories would complete that picture. Their combined stories would be the accurate, but because they cannot agree between themselves, and they cannot agree that it might be that the thing that we've approached is more complex than what we imagine it as a singular thing, they're left in the same position, again, of disagreement. Seers that don't see the whole picture. Another aspect of prophecy, I think, awakening, the ability to see, the ability to interpret.
You know, like Sulayman, I come from, and you, others, I come from a region which is filled with prophets. False prophets, real prophets, and I don't mean only the religious ones who have been telling us stories, but I spent most of the last 15 years watching these petty prophets, you know, commanders, leaders, presidents, you name them, each making a prophecy about a better future, about this eternal glory coming true. And you watch them kind of not only bring destruction and mayhem, but kind of these prophecies become a banner that would lead people to wars and destruction. So I wonder, why do we have such a abundance of prophets in this region? Is it because there's a discrepancy between your life, the realities of your life, and the and what you imagine your life should be. So, say you live in the Middle East, you have the poverty, you have the destruction around you, but then you've been told that this is the best land, that you're the greatest nation that came to earth. So, how do you reconcile these two facts? And I think this is when you have people come out and say, look, if we only go beyond that mountain, if we only attack that nation, if we only do this, things will become better. So maybe you need a prophecy because you need an illusion. You need something to convince you that tomorrow will be better.
Do you mean that the idea of the enlightened, what is it? Qa'id al-Mulhim.
Qa'id al-Darura, the leader, the necessity. Yeah.
The leader of the inspirational leader. I mean, is the inspirational leaders that you mentioned, from Gaddafi to Saddam to others, that to our day, lead their people into deeper and deeper misery? I mean, are they prophets, or are they I mean, they are strongmen, and they are.
But the difference between a strong man and a tyrant and a prophet is that those guys, and I don't mean only the big guys, even the smallest militia commander somewhere in a village would see himself as not only a leader, a commander, the leader of necessity, but he would sit, and it's always a he would sit and pontificate and talks about the future that is green, that is lush, that is coming to you. And they're always, for the last, 1,500 to 1,000 years, they've always been prophets of doom. Because whatever they talk about, those men, those kind of petty leaders, it's always ushers destruction. If I only invade that country, if I only take that village, things will be better. So and as we were talking about, a prophet needs a community that believes in the prophecy. So sometimes I would suggest, argues, that amongst the people there is a desire for something to come, and here comes someone who would turn that desire into poetry.
The prophecies work better. I mean, if we talk about the fertile fields or the fertile minds for prophecies to take place, I think we said prophecies depict an alternative. They depict an alternative which is communally acceptable, which a community says, yes, this is where we want to go. They're based on a reality also, because they negate a reality, and that reality is very much having to do with poverty or famine or conflict or war or disagreement of general proportions. So it's a negation of the existing and a depiction of what's to come. And that applies to so many aspects of our life today.
Just to go back to this, the idea of the inspirational leader. I mean, don't you feel that so much of their momentum is actually building upon the remains of religious structures? I mean, the position of the Qa'id al-Mulhim, the inspirational leader, occupies a position within a structure of belief that is pre-prepared, that has been pre-prepared for centuries by a religious structure, by a patriarchal religious structure. I mean, Saddam's Qadsiye. I mean, their recycling of history and their ablation of history. So they recycle elements of history that are useful to a narrative of power, and they ablate and destroy elements of history that are not useful to their narratives of power. But they use a structure of belief that they that they develop and harness.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to go back to that point, it is exactly they use this structure of belief, but to how do I convince you, my people, my men, to go on and fight for me and destroy everything? Because if you stand and you realize what's going on, you just revolt, you just destroy these structures, the patriarchal structures of belief. What do I do as a prophet, as an inspirational leader, is I tell you of my prophecy, of the future that is good for you, the good things that will come, if you follow 1, 2, and 3. And that is the secret. And that is the secret why they managed to lead. And again, I mean, from the biggest kind of tyrant dictator to a small petty militia commander in a destroyed street in the Middle East, they all speak about that prophecy over there beyond the corner, and that's where it comes from.
I was just going to point out, I mean, it seems to me that there's a fundamental difference between a leader and a prophet. I mean, a leader does exactly what we were just discussing. A prophet, does a prophet really have that kind of agenda? A leader has a clear agenda. Whatever he employs, he employs these things with an agenda. It seems to me a prophet, maybe where we started, is much more, it doesn't have that kind of agenda of accomplishing some mission, but rather presenting some radically different view of things. I'm not sure if the leader works in that way. I think it overlaps, but it seems to me the prophet has always been one to deliver something that appears to, a completely different narrative, and that destabilizing element seems to be the kind of key. How it gets co-opted is another, meaning the role of the prophet, the role of the leader, I think is an interesting one to look at. But
co-opted or corrupted. I mean, in the context of divinity, in the context of religion, it's exactly that. A prophet is a means. It's a channel through which a message is passed from the divine to the mundane. But at the same time, I think prophecies require reinvention. With time, prophecies are specific to a moment in time, and that's why they're fertile for that moment in time, for that moment in history, for that moment in conflict, whatever it might be, specific to a context. And once it grows beyond that context and it grows beyond that time, then it requires other prophets. It requires priests. It requires others to be able to interpret and pass on the message and update the message. It's no.
The other thing that comes to mind is that, I mean, we've talked about this in the past, but the idea that throughout history, that early part of history, it seemed that, and I'm referring to the Old Testament, it seemed like this was the fertile field of the prophet. And then we arrive around Newton's period, that the paradigm starts to change from prophecy to prediction with science. But the question for me is, as we move closer and closer to the present, and we rely more and more on science for prediction, what role that original idea of prophecy plays within this scientific paradigm? And now we would look at that as the irrational, right? And that certainly can't be part of the scientific paradigm. But what role would that destabilizing other presence play currently? Meaning, we don't, in fact, if we think of prophets, we probably think of them as discredited figures today. I don't think there are many prophets we look to say, this is or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, in the limited definition of the word, yes. But in a broader definition of the word, and I think we'll come to this in this discussion, is who are the modern prophets? What are they prophesizing about? In which direction are they leading us? What's the future that they're painting for us? What's our role in that future? How is that being corrupted? Because the word corrupted will also come to pass in this discussion. From that original prophecy, from that original intent, to what its manifestation is. Technology being one, of course.
Yeah, and one of the modern prophets, I would say, are these fortune tellers on TV and on satellite channels. They're so popular. People are crazy about them, and again, I think I think I can say that it's almost very easy to become a prophet. You know, you can just lay a path in front of you that says, well, I think tomorrow you'll have a very good day. Maybe 2 days later, it's not going to be so good. And again, a prophet will give the I mean, this is why they're so popular. This is why people pay thousands of dollars to listen to those people, because they are telling you things that you actually want to believe. So again, I go back to each of us, you know, probably each of us is like a tiny little prophet inside, and they want to listen to these prophets. And so that's one version of the modern prophet, a false one, of course.
What are the
Fortune tellers.
messages?
Fortune tellers.
tellers, the star signs, the horoscope writers.
The horoscope writers,
The gym instructors, those that are telling us how to live better, those that are telling us what to eat, how to eat better. I think there's a tendency for that.
But I would hold on to that original definition. How does the guy at the gym destabilize things with his prophecy?
Well, he works against processed foods. He works against corporations that sell processed foods or genetically manipulated foods. He talks about an organic existence. He talks about...
But it seems that it just reinforces a larger narrative as opposed to disturbing the narrative with some revelation that comes upon one. Isn't that the role? That's one role that we started
Sorry,
with, right?
but okay. So if we go back to the idea of disruption, and it's useful that we remember that very clear definition that Max Weber gave distinguishing between the prophet, the disruptor, the innovator, the one who breaks paradigms, and the priest, who comes latterly, whose function is to protect the status quo and to defend it. I mean, the prophet comes often, or at least the prophets whose messages later became widespread, successful. They come in moments of great societal change, great technological change. Either they're part of that change, or they instigate it, or they incorporate those elements of change into their narrative, into their program.
A prophet just walked into the
Prophet walked into this. So, I mean, you know, I mentioned this to you, Anthony, that I always find it grounding to think about how the development of the camel saddle and the discovery that a camel could be dressed in a piece of engineering that allowed it to carry up to 1,000 pounds of weight, that transformed this otherwise clunky figure into the equivalent of a steam train that was able to move goods and merchandise across huge expanses of territory without needing water for up to months in the winter, for up to a week in the summer. And it was the development of this technology that was fundamental in the ability of the Mohammedan message to be able to move across territories and expand. I mean, it was linked to actually the protection of trade routes. So one of the catalysts of the spread of Islam was the fact that trade, Muhammad himself having been a merchant, but that trade became a codified and protected mode of activity. So Islamic traders could have recourse to the judge or the qadi, and any rupturing of those rules was severely punished. And so the creation of a market, the instrumentalization of the new technology, was fundamental to the spread, to the rapid spread of Islam. I mean, that combined obviously with military conquests and what have you.
So basically, we're saying that in a time when each tribe had a prophet, which usually that role of the prophet was taken over by the poet, by the seer of the tribe, and this is why when the prophet came with his message, he was accused by his enemies of being nothing but a poet, nothing but a seer, nothing but a, he speaks whatever he wants to. And that, among all these different people, he managed to spread his message, and it went because there was a vision, because there was a technology attached to it, because, if we're not talking about the divine intervention, so...
There's a tension, there's an interesting tension between the idea of the prophet and the poet. I think since the very beginning, that tension is, you can trace it. So the prophet is the mouthpiece of God. The poet is a craftsman in words. It's the muse that inspires poets, and with the Greeks, in the case of the Greeks, it was Apollo who inspired the oracle. Apollo inspires the Pythian prophetesses. They speak in babble, like a sacred babble. And their sacred babble, which is kind of incomprehensible, is then taken by a crafty priest who reiterates this babble into an enigmatic formula that can be understood. That's the process of prophecy in ancient Greece. So it's a series of elocutions and then even reinterpretations of elocutions that guard a certain enigma, that are presented as the speech of the oracle. The poet, on the other hand, has his muse that inspires his elocution. And so there's a systematic tension between the poet, the poet's enunciation and the prophet's enunciation. And it led the Greeks to conclude that all poets, like all Cretans, were liars.
So it's also interesting because it raises the question of not just the spoken word, the prophet who speaks, but to interpret what is said. Who interprets, how it's interpreted, how it's transmitted, how it's brought to beyond the prophet. What do you do with the word? And it was interesting when you were explaining that the poet takes that babble, takes this version, formulates something that is, I assume, is more translatable.
Is the priest. The priest takes the babble of the prophetesses, of these Pythian prophetesses, who enter a kind of trance. They enter into a kind of trance, and they're in a transformed state. They enter into a trance, and they speak babble. And then it's the priest that comes to reinterpret this and say, this is what she's saying. This is what she's saying. This is what Apollo inspired her to say. Here is the version.
So are you suggesting that each prophet needs a priest, and the priest needs a church or an institution to transform, to translate the prophecy into instructions, into a roadmap for the community for the future?
I just think this relationship between language and the accessibility and understanding, the transparency of language, and the notion of the broadcasting of that or the dissemination of that is interesting. I mean, in the history of Christianity, I mean, Luther's unhinging of the enigma of Latin into a language that could be accessed by the people was a game changer.
Yeah.
It was a game changer for the power structures there. And in fact, interestingly, Luther, and one of the reasons for the massive success of his Bible was that he spoke a combination of High German and Low German. He stylistically, he had his finger on the pulse, creating a language that could be understood from the mountains to the coasts. It was that stylistic, how to say, skill that allowed him also to be a bestseller. I mean, Luther's Bible, if he'd just written in High German, he would have been understood only by a quarter of his readers.
So, irrespective of the completeness or the lack of completeness of messages, those that remain, those that have impact and effect beyond its own time, requires collaborators, requires others to be able to spin it and to make it relevant beyond that initial moment, whether that be in the economics of the time, whether that be in the politics of the time, whatever it might be. Certainly, so collaborators, I think, are very much part of whatever messages, whether those messages be of a divine nature or otherwise. But so I know it's difficult to separate the prophet from the message, but if one does separate it and say there's a message and the prophet only becomes the means of passing that message, then I think what the next interesting question for me certainly is, what are the messages that are being promoted today? What are those messages? What do they indicate? And where are they taking us? Where we are today, all of us, irrespective of class, nationality, boundaries. What's being predicted? What's being sold? What's being advertised?
What's happening in Baghdad, Ghaith?
A total failure of the prophecies. So the prophets came in 2003 and told us that if we topple this dictator and we install this regime, this democracy, then things will be amazing and brilliant. And that was the prophecy. And for So for 16 years, they were selling this prophecy. But then that discrepancy that I was talking about, the difference between the prophecy and the reality on the ground, became so wide and so huge that we are, not only in Iraq, but in the region of the past decade, is the decade of, one, collapse of the prophecy. Two, I think, is the emergence of the small prophets, the tiny prophets on a village scale, on a street scale. And you have a massive upheaval now in Iraq. The new prophets of what's going on in the country, I think, is every single demonstrator in the streets was calling for the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the political status quo, the destruction of the political parties, and the reintroduction of a new system. So when you have the failure of one big prophecy, Second, you have the people on the ground, the rebels trying to change the status quo. And early on, we were talking about, all the signs of Nihayat al-Zaman, the end of time. And I think it's brilliant. Whoever wrote these prophecies of the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the Mahdi, the end of time was so brilliant because they are so generic. You can read them and you can say, oh, this will happen in 1258 when the Hulagu came to Baghdad, or you can see it, oh, this happened, or it will happen. So this is what's going on. It's always you have the reinterpretation of a prophecy and the introduction of a new prophecy.
So wait a minute. We have to go back a little bit to this, because you're saying 2003 came the American-led invasion of Iraq, and with it a prophecy, a recipe, a program,
And prophets.
a promise.
Prophets from Rumsfeld to Bolton to all those preachers of a new democratic dawn in Iraq, ushered by American power, financed by Iraqi oil. It was a very appealing prophecy. Why? Because it talked about the demise of a dictator and the beginning of a new dawn. It was a beautiful prophecy.
But isn't the chaos that you describe the proliferation of the many prophets, the proliferation of the many prophets, the absence of central
Prophet.
command, the breakup of a country geographically, along sectarian lines, maybe even along generational lines. Isn't that all part of the prophecy? I mean, isn't that part of the Wolfowitz Rumsfeld prophecy?
True, and this is what takes us back to the destruction of the image of the Al-Qa'id al-Darura, the leader and necessity. And it creates another prophecy, but then the other prophecy also fails. So you have this dialectic kind of, path between one failed prophecy into another failed prophecy. And if we talk about realities on the ground, the fact that one prophecy failed does not make the other prophecy come true. So if one religion's prophet turned out to be a false prophet, the other religion's prophet does not necessarily, I'm not talking about religions, by the way, I'm talking about countries. So the fact that Saddam's images and prophecies and the glory of the future failed does not give credit and turn the prophecies of Rumsfeld into reality. And that's where you have another generations of small prophets or petty prophets. I mean, I think probably the moment when you realize that there is no prophecy, there is no future, this is what you have. Maybe that's a good starting point.
So, I mean, what's the consensus? I mean, what is the consensus there? I mean, is this a source of hope? You're saying what we see today in Baghdad, what we see today in Beirut, what we see today even in outside the parliament in Kuwait. I mean, are we revisiting a moment of the surge in desire for dignity that was
Of course.
the banner of the so-called Arab Spring? I mean, are these sources of hope?
Of course, it's forces of hope. There is an amazing moment of hope. Why? Because we are at the moment of the destruction of the temple. Always there is a hope of a better future when the temple is shaken, destroyed, the powers are destroyed. Now, what comes later is where?
What comes, as we know, is the void, right? This, you destroy all, you have the void. However, that void gets filled. It's both promising and incredibly tenuous, right?
Tell us. You've been talking about this. Tell us about the flood. Tell us about the great flood of Louisiana.
We were talking about this the other day, and I think it's important because with hope, with the idea that something else comes, brings upon the kind of destruction of what's there. But there's this overwhelming void, and how that void gets filled, obviously, is crucial. And keeping one's eye on some imagined future and without occupying that stuff, I think it almost sets itself up for a kind of failure.
So after the floods in Louisiana, was there a hope of a better future? Did prophets come to the land and talk about a better reconstruction, a better future for the land? And how did these prophecies turn?
Well, in the case of New Orleans, as we said, right after the storm, the kind of shock of devastation, the shock of what happened, 80% of the cities on the water, the gutting of the public institutions, that didn't need a prophecy. Those prophets had already been speaking at a national level. So the gutting of the public institutions and the putting in place of kind of neoliberal policy allowed for a completely new thing to emerge. And again, it was in the void of the destruction that these new things happened. It could have very well gone a completely different way. It could very well have been radically different things could have filled that void, but what filled the void instead was rather regressive kind of policy that had been waiting for an opportunity. And I think, as we spoke about Iraq as well, it's the same kind of void that generated the ability to put in place some new vision, right?
I think because it's prescribed. I think it's because, it's the same in Afghanistan. Things that work elsewhere will work for you in the same way that they worked elsewhere, with the same speed as they worked elsewhere. So the void requires ideas to fill it. If those ideas are locally provided, interpretations of other ideas, mutations of other ideas, they tend to graft. The graft takes. Where they're direct impositions, whether it's of the free market, commercialism. I mean, one of the things that moves into the voids very quickly is laissez-faire economics, is
The
big
IMF.
corporations, the IMF. Yeah. And what they tend to do is they apply the same formulas, irrespective of the specificity of a place, of a people, of what it needs at that particular moment, the loans and the infrastructure projects, and So while that as an initial intervention to fill the void, I think is required, of course. Who doesn't want education? Who doesn't want roads or bridges or hospitals? Of course we want. But how they manifest themselves as physical tools is one thing from a society that needs to fill its own aspirations, its own ideas of what it wants to be and where it wants to go. And that cannot be cut and paste from one place to another.
So if we're talking about, since the beginning, about false prophets and failed prophecies, and the leader as the prophet of his days and his time, but there are true prophets. I mean, art is true prophecy. I mean, they are the true prophets of our time. They are the people who would come at one point and draw or say or shoot something, and that their vision becomes a reality. Can we consider the artist a prophet?
I'm interested in developing some things around that, but I want to just go back a second because we're not finished with this question of the void. So I mean, it seems to me that we are in a moment of civilizational development where there is only one voice. That is the voice of capital. Wherever the void, wherever the rupture, enter Deus ex machina, capital. Is that sustainable? How far can we go having this being the only protean, magical solution to the voids that surround us. I mean, you know, it's not just anecdotic, but the Lebanese street protests of the last few weeks. The straw that broke the camel's back was the decision to tax WhatsApp messages, right?
But it is interesting that, I mean, if we go back a little bit in time, even to the Cold War, there were two strong models, right, that were at stake. Most of the, meaning the market, capitalism, and these other models, all these other models have fallen by the wayside. How many people are still believing in these other models? So by default, you end up with this market as the unilateral, kind of homogeneous kind of thing. For me, what's interesting is to go back again where we started, and if there is only one vision, one voice, who begins to disrupt? Who begins to deliver some other vision?
Well, we're also in a moment where that protean force of capital is in the process of metamorphosis. It's in a process of metamorphosis through technology. And the interface of capital and technology, I would say, is the prophetic book of the next 50 years.
I'm more interested in who's the prophet that's going to interrupt that continuum, because all of these mutations of technological mutations, it doesn't interrupt the market, right? They advance the market.
It advances the market inside your skull.
Inside
Inside your skull.
right.
I mean, your skull is the new market.
Well,
The
profits.
territories of your brain.
Yeah, and that's how corrosive it has become. That's the false prophecy of the market, is that it gives you things that you need and you cannot live without. Things that extend your life, things that extend your beauty, things that make things comfortable for you and that enable you to do things that otherwise would have been considered magic some years back. So that's the fallacy. That's the hook. That's how you're incorporated into this. At the same time, I think that the next profits arise from conditions. And the conditions of that kind of exploitative market economy we see it. We see it in the environment. We see it in where we're headed. We see it in change. We see it in so many levels. So profits will emerge when necessity requires them to emerge. And whether they be people who advocate for a total destruction of the status quo, or whether they be people that depict other alternatives, other ways of being, other ways of existing that are more sustainable to us, that is more equitable, more just for the billions that live on poverty. Those are conditions, and the conditions are ripe.
So, the Chinese Communist Party has regularly updates its public-facing documents in terms of the relationship of state technology and society and the future. I mean, we have two models today working in the world, right? We have a Chinese Communist Party model that says, in its documentation, technology is to be used to help predict movements in society and ensure social well-being. This is the authoritarian model. And if you are a Uyghur Muslim in China, very difficult for you to escape the surveillance, the state. In Silicon Valley, we have other proponents of the liberating powers of technology to enable, the magic that you're saying, I don't know, food delivery at any hour, whatever, buy stuff. But it is equally omnipresent. It is equally pervasive. So it seems beyond doubt to me that the frontiers of technology into our civilization today are the defining parameters of our moment. And the question is how to create spaces outside of that net. Is there the possibility of the new? And can that come from within? Or must it come from without? And if it's to come from without, that's the question. I mean, can the new come from within?
Which is exactly what you're doing now. You're sitting and you're prophesizing about a scenario that is going to, or this room is doing here is not very different from a tent somewhere in the middle of a desert somewhere where people realize that there is a failure in the society. Something is not right. Whatever is happening is not going to work eventually there. So they start prophesizing a doomsday if another path is not taken. That is a prophet. Sulayman, I declare you a prophet from this room.
Please.
But this is this is the role of a prophet as a society changer. This is what an artist, a writer, a thinker is doing.
Con permesso, I read you a little section from this beautiful address that Jean Cocteau made in his last filmed appearance. He made this in, I think it was 63, 64. He made an address to the year 2000. Jean Cocteau says of himself, in the most humble sense, in the most humble way possible, says, I am a prophet. So in his address, it's beautiful, and you must watch it. He says, I predict anti-gravitation. St. Augustine was not wrong, since Tokyo is not the other side of us, and we are not the other side of Tokyo. There is no upside down and downside up. If Burkhardt suspects that one shouldn't fly but fall, he may be right. By now, he says, speaking to the year 2000, you may have discovered, like the ancient Incas, some gold or unknown metal, which seems light but is in fact very heavy. And that instead of rising, you, young people who I am addressing in the future, are in fact falling. Here indeed is the problem. These days we are ripping things up from the earth with very expensive machines that cost a lot of money and are prone to accidents. I don't know what's going on for you now, but I hope your youth is not straddling contradictions, as our youth is today, back in 64. We remain apprentice robots. I hope you have not become robots. but that you have become very humanized. End of quote.
What the false prophets?
Are we? Do we remain? I mean, let's respond to Cocteau's question. I mean, do we remain apprentice robots? Have we moved up are we better apprentice robots today, or are we more humanized?
Well, the more we move up, the more we advance, the more we're bound to the things that help us advance, no? We're bound to our phones, we're bound to our cameras, we're bound to technology in general. So, in fact, are we more liberated than people were 100 years ago, or are we less liberated? And do we consider that liberation? Do we consider it in terms of our outreach, our access to information, our ability to communicate simultaneously across the world? Is that, and it might very well be, there might be aspects of liberation that's built into aspects of subjugation. Technology, how it keeps track of us, where we are, where we're not. These are all, I think, issues. So the answer to that question, I'm afraid, is we're, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that we're less advanced than we were.
Less human.
Less human than we were. I think so. I took a leap there. I don't know. It's a hypothesis. I'm glad or happy to be questioned.
What's interesting to me is, again, the constant of a kind of resistance and the constant. And he's speaking in the 1960s, clearly speaking of a moment that this kind of presence of resistance. And then the question kind of becomes, is it really these small incremental moves that should be seen as the model, or is it the big eruptions, the big massive changes? And those are the two models that we're left with, right? You have the French Revolution on the one hand, you have the British kind of incremental change on the other, right?
Well, there was civil war.
Well, I'm just saying that we can abstract those two models. And I think it gets to a point, like even in the 60s, the optimism of what would be replaced by these efforts, and to what degree this other thing actually does in fact replace a former system. You follow what I mean? I mean, to what degree is it just a kind of, is all we're hoping for are slow incremental changes that's a kind of constant, or some larger eruption?
I have a question to kind of follow what Ajmal was saying. Is a prophet right in one period and then wrong in another? So do we judge a prophet or prophecy eternally, or is it time limited? Yani, the paragraph you read is totally, I don't think it's right in 2000. But does it have a time limit? A certain prophecy is fulfilled, say, 600 AD, but then it becomes false in, say, 2000 AD. So how do we judge the time limit of a prophecy? Or is a prophecy, an open ended warranty? I throw a prophecy here in this room and then it stays. So
I
think it's in the reverberations.
So there's that quote, that says, I don't know, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So I put it to you again. You keep dodging this question, dear gentlemen. Do we need to contemplate or even wish for civilizational meltdown, collapse, in order to be able to correct where we are heading? I'm playing the role of deep pessimist. I'm saying to you that where we are heading bodes ill, and that Cocteau's question here of "I hope you have not become robots, but you have become more humanized." Actually, today we're 2019. I think that we're heading. The way we are heading is bad fast. And every day it gets faster. And every day we get more locked into the bad fast apprentice robot movement. I mean, certainly, if you listen to the Greta Thunberg discourses, you know, I mean, there is an example of of a young prophetess, perhaps. And she says to the UN, "Don't give me any more of you. Don't have any more of you. We can't have any more of you. We have to make rupture with you." That's us, by the way. We're the dying species.
But I think it's an interesting question. Can we imagine, or it appears easier to imagine the end, total destruction, than it is to imagine the alternative. And the idea of having some alternative. In fact, it's actually it's quite interesting, because right now we're able to articulate what we don't want, meaning globally, more than we are able to articulate what we do want, meaning as something to put forward, right?
It's a duality. I mean, there has to be an end that requires a salvation. There has to be an end that we're going towards that requires people to come up with ways to avoid that end. So I think the duality of all of this is for me, quite apparent. I don't want to stray into the area of divine or religious or spiritual or moral, but at the same time, I think it's a continuity. I mean, it's like it's maybe not the best of examples, but it's like no ship sails in a straight line. What it tends to do is go off a bit to the right, and then it corrects itself and comes back a bit to the left.
That is apology. Sorry, you are making an apologist's argument for what I am saying is I'm saying we're locked into
a battle.
I'm saying we're locked into a barren, dehumanized mode of development, and I don't see how, at this point, I don't see how we break out of that, either the combination of authoritarian control through technology or capitalist frenzy aided by technology. I see those as the two positions of a potential future, and I don't see a third way at this point in time.
Well,
That's crucial.
if I were to respond to that, a third position or a third way would require people to accept and understand the first two positions. It means, in some sense, that there have been, by leaps and bounds, there have been stages of human progress, but coming at a cost. So human progress meaning that we're more in touch with each other, we're closer with each other, we're able to do things, again, that were just simply unimaginable 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's a reality of today. And the downside to that is the impacts it has on us, the impact it has on our interaction and exchange with each other, and the impact that it has on the environment. So I don't think it's an either or. It's certainly not a black or white. It certainly isn't something that can be negated. There are good things, I would argue, and then there are bad things. And fine, I think that if we allow the market or the politics to figure out what the bad things are, they're simply too interested in themselves, and for them the bad things don't matter. So I would say the prophets, if there are any, prophets on both sides, if there are two sides, would advocate for their own message. But the Prophet, from the side of averting disaster, averting catastrophe, averting, the end of the world, global warming, whatever that would be, Greta Thunberg, I think their role is to be heard, to speak, is to speak in the ways that they speak, and to garner reactions.
So,
But I think more fundamentally is the question you just raised. If, in fact, the paradigm, as you were suggesting, if the paradigm is one of progress and catastrophe are two sides of the same coin, as Hannah Arendt put it, then it means how do you move beyond that kind of paradigm? I mean, or we're doomed to be in that paradigm and just continue to work with that. It seems that that's really what's at stake. Even the awareness that that's where we are, right? That with technology, with the development of more and more sophisticated things, there's a dark underside that comes with that.
It's because of the way that it's being done.
I don't
in
know.
my opinion, to a large extent.
I don't know.
It's not necessarily that
I don't know if
technology
it's
is
inherent or not.
bad
is
per
my
se.
question.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm responding to that. I don't think that technology is bad per se. I think increasing your profit margins to the point where people live in poverty and you exploit the environment to the point that you give your shareholders massive windfalls, I think that's where the exaggeration comes in.
But I want to kind of put things in historical context always. I mean, think of 4 people sitting in a tent sometime in, I don't know, some desert somewhere between Switzerland and Paris. And they're debating the misfortunes of their times. They're talking about one empire controlling another. They're talking about diseases and deforestation and whatnot. And they're talking about the end of times, 2,000 years ago. And then suddenly someone comes and says, well, we can't do so and so and so. So, yes, things are doomed as they are now, but without prophets, without Greta, without call them prophets, call them leaders, call them anything, things won't change. But things do change because we know throughout history that things change. I mean, whether they will change on time or whether it will bring misery. I mean, yesterday we were walking in Venice and we were slouching through water, kind of a tiny little flood, and then Anthony tell us of 1 meter of sea level, rise in sea level is nothing compared. And then we saw the effects yesterday of 15 centimeters? So this is a prophet. Here's a prophet, a scientist talking about the future. And it is there. And he's prophesizing that. And are we humans kind of ignorant, sitting there rejecting the modern prophets, rejecting the scientists? So we're talking about the false prophets. But then there are real prophets, prophets who are talking about things that are happening in front of our eyes. And we reject and we reject. So, yes, I agree with you guys. But at the same time, I think throughout history, some humans could manage to change the course of history if we were.
So, question then. You're saying, you guys, Ghaith, Ajmal, you're saying that that progress will lead us through. That you'll measure our ability to navigate through the future as a civilization. That you think that there's a good chance that we can make it. Right? I mean,
I'm not saying this. I'm not assuming to say this, nor I want to sound like one of those guys who say, "Oh, progress will come through technology." But what I'm saying is, it's not. I mean, we've been through these crises before throughout our history. Maybe not as drastic as this one, but there's always been a crisis, and we can sit or we can change. So what I'm arguing is for Greta to lead the army of believers.
No, what I'm trying to get at is that your notion of alterity, the idea that something new can emerge. What I'm trying to say to you is that the space of alterity is being radically reduced every day. And
The space of what?
Of alterity, of otherness. If we going back to this idea of the disruption, of the source of the disruption, where is there anywhere that we can imagine that is off the grid, off the controlled mechanism, that where might be the source of alternatives?
So what's interesting to me is, this notion that technology would aid us, I think it's really silly.
Yes.
Historically,
Nefarious. I think it's nefarious.
No one's arguing for that.
Historically, it has been silly to assume that. In fact, if we let's pick one example. Let's look at civil rights in the U.S. Just how to move forward with trying to achieve civil rights for blacks in America. And if you look at that as a movement, so much was at stake, and it's persisted slowly. And I think by looking at the ways that movement has arrived at some relative success, the idea of progress, the idea of technology had nothing to do with that, right? It required a completely different.
I would argue the reverse. I would say that alienation, the other, are the foundations of discrimination. We are different from each other. And I think technology has shown us that we're not so different from each other. It's given us access to each other. It's shown us, whether it be the internet, whether it be TV, whether it be satellite imagery, whether it be
fake news,
whether it be the simultaneous projection of cinema, black cinema, of sport, of song, of creative endeavors like music. I think those things have contributed to us understanding each other better. Now, is technology a solution to our problems? No, of course not. But it's also a tool. It's how you use that tool. If you use it to disseminate fake news and alternative realities, and that's also okay.
I'm all for tools.
But what I'm saying is, I'm not arguing that kind of technology will bring us to the solution. So I'm going back to this whole notion of a prophecy, of we are in time of great upheaval. We are going through, phenomenal change, and which will lead into a disaster if we continue this course of existence, of being as we are. Then there are prophets. False prophets, real prophets, prophets of doom, prophets of change and something. I think just despairing, sitting in a tent and despairing will not lead us out of this. And this is to go back to your point, Sulayman. What's happening now, a decade after civil wars, you would argue that a nation, say Iraq, or Lebanon, both nations have been through civil wars, both nations have broken and destroyed, and yet people are going to the streets calling, with the huge risk of another round of fighting and civil war, calling for a change because the status quo cannot be maintained. And this is a prophecy. It is not a single man or a single woman or a poet or something, but a group of people. A prophecy as a general feeling, unconscious feeling amongst a nation. They want a change, and change is what we always.
So you're saying revolution that
carries a tiny little prophecy with it. It aspires for something.
I think that's
shaking the temple.
Base of all prophecy has to be change. It cannot be anything else. Otherwise, prophecies don't work. They filter, they fizzle.
Exactly.
I think the aspects of prophecy that are also interesting is not only undermining the current status quo, whatever condition, but also proposing an alternative. And that alternative then can be pure in its initial essence, but then has to be taken on by others and evolved.
I want to ask you a question, Ajmal. I'm interested. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you work with the past in your work in Kabul? How the past influences your practice?
Well, in our parts of the world, our pasts are very important for us, whether they be in our identities, whether they be in our legacies or the legacies of our forefathers, or in the physical manifestations of how we dress and our tangible and intangible culture, but also in our monuments and in those remnants of, we don't talk about it in terms of 200 or 300 or 1,000 years. We talk about it in terms of 4, 5, 6,000 years of history. So in the context where I work, an understanding of where we've come from is very important to take stock or to deal with where we are today.
Keep going.
Yeah.
I mean, tell me more about the relationship with the material past, with tangible modes of making stuff.
Yeah, it's an act, and it's an act that again binds you to the place, it binds you to others, and there's a communalism to it, which, you know, again, the basis of Islam is communal prayer, communal worship, communal exchange and interaction. So Afghanistan is very much, you know, in that context, is very communal in the way things are done, and the materiality of the place, making do with what you've got, the ingenuity, the resilience of that population, despite the past 40 years of history, are things that we work with and that we use.
So that's what leads you, for instance, to work with rammed earth technology.
For example, it's actually a very old way of working, and in fact, in the current context of things, it's very sustainable as a material, and there's a move back to that. And you know, I think one would have to separate out ideas of nostalgia or romanticism, because there's a lot of that with respect to our areas, you know, whether it be in the 19th century or 20th century. The point of it being that it's about reinterpretation, and it's about where that reinterpretation is done, and it's about active, conscious decisions of how you want to engage with the bigger world, and how that world is relevant to you, what aspects of that world are relevant to you. Homogeneity is certainly not something that many Afghans want. They want to retain certain aspects of their own identity, culture, and others that they're happy to update. They're happy to look towards others.
So how does that work with, well, let's say, the making of a window? I mean, you know, when you renovate ancient buildings or historic buildings, I mean, do you ever open new windows, or do you only take the apertures that are there and...
Wicked Sulayman. So if he doesn't open a new window, you're suggesting he is rejecting a prophecy and a future. If he keeps open windows,
No,
you
not
are
at
putting
all.
him in a trap.
Not at
Answer
all.
the
No,
question.
no.
No,
I'm actually very interested
there's an answer.
in this, in the just the physical materiality of this stuff.
No, there's an answer, and architecture is the basis of answers. The architecture of today is not the architecture of the past. There's difference to it, and technology has a big role in that, and aspiration has a big role in that, and materiality has a big role in that. So irrespective of the fact that architecture and the construction industry is one of the main culprits of global warming, and you know, where the world stands on the brink, aside from that, it's about use. At the end of the day, it's about practicality. It's about how you use a building. If you use a building in the same way that it was used 600 years ago, then from our perspective, there isn't much need to change that. But if you use a building for a different purpose, and the shell is the shell, and today something happens that didn't happen there 300 years ago, then that requires an intervention. Again, selectively. One needs to, you know, kind of encapsulate what that architecture was. don't change it. But so there's a deliberate decision making of what to retain, what not to retain, and for which purposes. Some of it is technical, some of it is aspirational. But I think it would say, one could say that that's a reinterpretation of a statement. And whether that statement rises to the level of prophecy is a different issue. But
you, sorry, I'm going to keep going through this a little bit, because you take techniques, building techniques, carpentry techniques, maybe even irrigation techniques, I don't know, from past masters or from past modes of making. How do you do that? How do you avoid amnesia? And given the context, I mean, we're talking about Kabul, we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about a country that has been ripped to hell by war endlessly for the last 50 years, right? So how does that work? How does that process?
There's an analogy in conservation which I think applies very much. So war destroys. With destruction there's debris, and mixed into that debris you've got elements of who you are, but you've also got new elements. You've got remnants of depleted plutonium or depleted uranium shells. So the first action is to clean. To look, to find the source of what the buildings are. And sometimes it's the foundation, sometimes it's the walls. And the next action is to decide what of that you want to retain and what of that you don't need anymore. And the third action is to make new.
Can I tell you a small story? So once upon a time, I was in Mogadishu, in Somalia, almost a decade ago. It was during the last round of famine. Somalia, again, another country destroyed by wars, destroyed by false prophets, and I was walking in a neighborhood called Hamarwain. And Hamarwain is like one of old Mogadishu. That's where the Arab traders live, where the Indians came, and where the Italians. You have these all beautiful symbols of architecture, from white Italian villas to old Arabic houses. But then the war came and destroyed everything, and the people fled. And what happened in a decade? Nature took over that part of town, because it was the front line. And I've seen that in Iraq, and I've seen in other places. The moment human beings disappear, the moment war comes, suddenly you realize that nature comes back, so the old comes back, and then at the same time, as I was walking in between these kind of trees and shrubs, I see this pattern under the sand, and I just start kicking, and it's an old marble tiled floor that belonged to a villa that doesn't exist anymore. The prophecy collapsed, the temple collapsed, nature took over. And then you have only the traces. And then in the future, someone else will build, and things will happen. This is just to kind of talk about what Ajmal was saying. Is you look for what is left of the old.
That's still relevant today.
I'm interested in ruins and how ruins might provide templates for a notion of regeneration. That's what I'm asking you about that work, and your story speaks to that.
But there's also the other aspect of it. When those things were built, at the time they were built, they were, I would say, representational of both the aspirations of that time and the technologies of that time, the highest level of creativity of that time. And we are now in a different time. The demographics are different, the populations are different, the way they live are different, the way they exist are different. So applying one-to-one technologies that existed hundreds of years ago, or methods or forms or typologies, may not necessarily work. There is a process of reinvention, and that reinvention means reinterpretation, and I think it applies to everything, including prophecies. I think prophecies
So
need to be updated.
So you two are both architects. I mean, I'm interested also. Let's talk a little bit. What is what's prophetic architecture in the field of architecture? I mean, to go back to Cocteau, he complains in that movie I was telling you about. He complains about the thing called he calls it Esperanto architecture. he says, I hope that you guys aren't still living in Esperanto architecture where they coop you up in barracks and buildings and call them homes.
So, the first answer to your question, what is prophetic architecture? In the 20th century, it was called the kind of powerful visionary master plan, right? And those have bitten the dust so hard that no one wants to touch it anymore. Because the first half of the 20th century is filled with visionary plans of the future and the role that visionary urbanism might play. Those have been condemned based on the very idea of the central planner, right? The very idea that someone might be in control of an entire city, that vision of an entire city based on a single mind has been largely discredited. By the 1960s, I was part of a whole move to overthrow that kind of thinking. So that role of prophetic architecture has achieved a pretty bad rap, right? So, but to rethink the question, what might be the role of prophetic architecture and does it need to fall into that same trap would be the interesting one, right? Is there another role for prophetic architecture and not the former one?
Sorry, go on.
No, just kind of to follow up what Antonio says. Ajmal was saying that each prophecy has a time limit. And probably when kind of Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and the whole kind of Weimar Republic Bauhaus were talking in the 20s about a central planning, massive building, massive reconstruction of the 50s that turned into the vertical slums of today. There was a prophecy. That was a prophecy that had a time limit and failed miserably. So, I mean, I apologize, but architects are the worst of prophets. They always fail in their prophecies. The ones who try to generalize, the one who wants to talk about a single idea, a single modular to solve. I mean, from Da Vinci till today, we have a history of failed architecture.
Today, I mean, we are in an era of the star architect. I mean, today
when was an architect not a star?
But today there's a few of them that can be named on one hand, right? I mean, there's not a project in the Gulf that takes place without one of the star architects signing it off. It's as if those
the hand of the divine touching, exactly as you're saying.
I mean, unless Jean Nouvel has made it, it's like it's not valid for use. I really don't understand.
And in Iraq, unless Zaha Hadid has not blessed it, it's not a building.
There was the unmade plans that of Frank Lloyd Wright in Baghdad. Did you ever come across these?
Yes.
He made a whole series of plans, right, for the university on the island.
The university was built much later. This is where I studied. Yes, it was his actual plans, and they were lovely. But if you see his sketches, if you see his prophecies of the city, on how the city will evolve, compare it to the reality today on the ground, I mean, I don't think there's a worse false prophet than Frank Lloyd Wright in Iraq.
You mean that his plans were misinterpreted?
No, I mean his vision was very wrong because he presumed a city will have green spaces, a city will grow gently. He did not foresee, and who would have foreseen that, the wars, the destructions, the civil war, the migration from the south, from the areas where there was a front line with Iran, during the millions of people who migrated into Baghdad. And Baghdad is a city dying today out of thing. and obviously, if you see the prophecy of Frank Lloyd Wright and compared to the reality of the ground, I mean, I would love to live in that city, but it doesn't exist because reality moved so quickly that proved his prophecies
So
false.
there are two very different models we're discussing here. One of the for instance, the Frank Lloyd Wright's plans for Baghdad, or the Jean Nouvel approach to implanting structures into the Gulf, for instance, today. The Louvre in Abu Dhabi, Alula now that is also being designed as an eco center in Saudi Arabia, centered around the Nabatean civilization.
What's the different models?
The different model is for instance, the work that Ajmal is making
Exactly.
in Kabul, right? Where the relationship with civilizational knowledge
Thank you. Yes.
is deeply anti-global, in the sense that it's rooted in what the techne, the skill set, the craft of that particular geography, those particular contingencies led to. But they're very different models. And I feel that part of our quandary today, I mean, certainly in the Gulf, for instance, is our inability, our fear, and it's a kind of philosophical cowardice vis-a-vis accumulated local knowledge.
تعرف يعني sometimes I worry and I'm afraid if you travel in the desert between Iraq and Syria, you see all these old deserted palaces built by the Umayyad and the Abbasid Caliphs because that was the hunting ground and there used to be lots of water and lots of wildlife. Lions, gazelles and whatnot. And so they built these complexes, massive, and it left to they became atlal, ruins today, because they were visions of an unsustained reality. You know, you are a king and you build your own palace in the desert to go hunting, and then once you're toppled, once your vision is destroyed, once there is a revolution, the palace stays as ruins. I mean, speak about Saddam's architecture.
No, let's not speak about Saddam.
No. But these massive, gigantic spaceships like mosques and palaces, they were all turned into kind of.
So, but I mean, I agree with you on one level. I mean, the best architecture for the desert is the tent, right?
No, but the best. I mean, both of us are agreeing that what Ajmal is doing is being a prophecy that is close to earth, close to reality, close to the people who are living there, and a sustainable prophecy.
Well, it's a process, right? I mean, I think that. So the Jean-Luc Godard film Alphaville. It's like a sci-fi movie where books are contraband, and all books are controlled by the state, and then books and words disappear from circulation. So they're centrally controlled, and then there's the group of beautiful rebels who have their own stash of stuff and resurrect the lost words and the lost books and circulate them and what have you. I mean, the amnesia, I say again, amnesia. I mentioned to you yesterday the example of the Chinese Wikipedia, that you can look up the history of or every year, and the Chinese equivalent of Wikipedia gives you the definition of it, and it tells you what happened in such and such a year. But 1989, the year of Tiananmen Square, doesn't exist on the Chinese Wikipedia. It doesn't exist. It's Alphaville. 1989 is Alphaville.
Well, in Turkey, you don't even have the Wikipedia.
But wait, I mean, you don't have to go to Turkey. I mean, what was it that your supreme leader said yesterday or a few days ago that the Trump said what the Kurds didn't even help us on D-Day? So.
We all have to go back to fly.
So amnesia. What I'm saying is that this notion of systematic amnesia in a connected world. I mean, never was it easier to make the idea of the ellipsis, the hiatus, the gap more significant and more impactful than in a connected world. You know,
I mean, the challenges are bigger for both prophets and fake prophets alike to build a community around them. And I think technology to an extent has made that challenge greater because more people have access to information and in that sense are less likely to be convinced. But at the same time, the propagation of fake news, the propagation of anti-science. I mean, there's science, and then there is scientists who disseminate information which is contrary to what others' findings is. The establishment of doubt, preaching to the converted, but the establishment of doubt in connection to the self-interest of groups. I think prophets in this day and age, whether they be the ones you just mentioned or whether they be ones that are advocating for other things, they're essentially fighting over a population, and a population which is beyond borders, a population which is much
you said
larger.
There were prophets today. I mean, you guys are sort of saying the prophets. I mean, aren't we in need of a new religion?
No, but if we but if we take people like Orwell and others, and Orwell, of course, built on the prophecies of others like a novel, and others, and he prophesied a society that is, kind of a society not very far from where we're living today. And at one point we thought Orwell's prophecies, especially in 1984, were false prophecies. Tamam, because the Soviet Union collapsed, that kind of, authoritarian societies no longer exist. But look where we are today. This is exactly what you're telling us about the Chinese society, about the way they use information technology to achieve all what Orwell was talking about in the 40s. And he was talking about different part of the world, and he was talking about different political system. But we are there. The supreme leader of Anthony, he is a character from
AKA Donald Trump.
Salamullah alayhi.
Salamullah alayhi.
This is exactly where we are. This is exactly. And is Orwell a false prophet? Of course not. So prophecies do exist.
They do exist, and prophets do exist, and they're depicting, as we speak in this bunker today, they're depicting realities that we may or may not agree with completely or wholly or partially, but they exist, and there is as far as I'm concerned, there is a battle over the souls of humanity. And that battle is being played out in different ways, whether it's regional or whether it's global or whether it's in a very local way. Is the messaging comprehensive to some extent? Yes. When it comes to economics, it is comprehensive. It's very clear how the world is, in this sense, the complexions and the varieties have changed. Economics is the same in Afghanistan. Okay, the way it's being practiced might be different, but the economics is the same in Afghanistan as it is in Los Angeles.
I want to hear from you a little bit, Anthony, about prophetic architecture and what it means to live in a world, to live in an aquatic world.
Well, whether that's prophetic architecture or not, certainly it's out of the difference between a kind of, let's say, visionary architecture that we were referring to in the early 20th century and a kind of, in your terms, aquatic or floating architecture, is, I assume what you're referring to, that's just a kind of almost a necessity to deal with what we're seeing what we're seeing right now in Venice, what all data is showing that an inevitable sea level rise. And when that happens, given that the majority of the largest cities are on coasts, and as the sea level rise, obviously more people will be affected than not. And how do you deal with that? So I'm not sure if I'd place that in the role of visionary or prophetic architecture. It's a kind of almost, on the one hand, a practical adaptation to a given circumstance. And some of the most interesting stuff, without a doubt, that I know going on is really in Southeast Asia. It's in Bangladesh, it's in Vietnam, it's in many, many places. And because those are the areas where it's being affected much more immediately, and they're just reacting in rather intelligent ways. But I don't think it comes with that baggage of the vision and the prophecy, right? In the way that maybe in the 20s and 30s, architects would have been more inclined to do. So I don't know if it's a matter of rethinking what that means, but it's, yeah, I don't think it comes with that great proclamation of what the future must be. It's more a kind of reaction to what is. And I don't know if that says something of a kind of model, as opposed to some more abstract vision of the future, as opposed to a reaction. And to some degrees, I mean, I wonder if the model we're just discussing about Afghanistan, the working model, to what degree is it just a kind of almost practical reaction to what is given that is forging innovation without a doubt. And I would call the things that are going on innovations, extraordinary innovations, but I'm not sure if they have the visionary role to them. That would be my take. But maybe we have to rethink what vision is, meaning maybe these models have some sort of ability.
I'm curious. The influence of Hellenistic art in the Oxus Valley. Do you deal with relics and things that have the remains of that syncretism, of that meeting of Hellenistic craft with Hindu and Buddhist influences? Do you have objects like that you work with?
Not specifically, but I think the country, the morphology, the people, the demographics, and the regions, and the diversity in that, and all of that, I think is very much exemplary of, if you want, whether it be 2,500, 3,000 years ago or more recently, a meeting of multiple cultures and belief systems, and including the Silk Road, which runs through parts of Afghanistan,
to Venice,
all the way to Venice. So I think that exchange, I mean, maybe the last time the world was as globally connected as it is today, with the exception of the impositions of the 16th to the 20th century, would have been in the 14th and the 13th and the 12th century, as that area was the kind of center of exchange, of commerce, of trade, of mingling, of diversity, so to speak, more than any other place, in fact, of that time. So I think from that perspective, with relation to where we stand today, I think there are cycles, and those cycles are repetitive, and they depend on a variety of things, and they are not necessarily judged or not necessarily tracked or incrementalized by one lifetime or 100 lifetimes. And these cycles move and they change, and we can already see that, how things move from one region to another, and the emergence of East Asia, and with it, the re-emergence of all of the Central Asian countries. It's simply, I think, inevitable that happens.
I mean, I'm talking about these civilizational, the intermeshing of civilizational history, in a way, as a counterpoint to where we are today, in terms of everything we were saying about the interconnectivity and the openness of our societies, the juggernaut of the single market, etc. I mean, I question whether we are in fact more open today than we were, whether we are more open to the possibility of syncretic thinking and making than we were in previous times. And also, I think that part of our ability to navigate the future is really very intimately linked to our ability to sound the past.
Permission to throw.
Con permesso.
Con permesso. Permissione. Con permesso. Isn't going back to an old methods of architecture that's very harmonious for the society, isn't that like a failed of a prophecy? So isn't that kind of going back to the tent? We failed. This has been a failure. So let's go back to the old way of using timber and something. Or is that... So what Ajmal is doing in restoring old architecture, is that a failure of a prophecy? From a Soviet perspective, of course it is, because they came to Kabul that they wanted to construct concrete cities. Or is that a belief in the society, and that's the way forward? So sometimes we always talk about prophecy about something new, something emerging, something fantastic. But maybe going back is.
I mean, I think it has to do with, and I'll use these words only once, I think it has to do with harmony and balance. Harmony and balance, well, I said that twice, within a context, within a people, within the specificities of a region. What I see in Dubai and across the Middle East at the moment, that's I wouldn't use those terms to describe them. I would describe them as impositions. Fine. Those impositions may make life more sustainable. It might make it more comfortable. It might make it... It's an argument by some. It might make it easier to live in those harsh environments. But then I would say that rather than advocating for the way that we should live, or the way that we lived 1,000 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, which was also sustainable to a large extent within those specific environments, I would say that there is a cause and a need for people to reinterpret what those interventions are and how they can be more specific and how they can use the more positive aspects of what we know today, how we build today, to cater to slightly different aspirations. And aspiration is important. You can't detach aspiration. You cannot tell a child in Afghanistan that your aspiration is to be simply a farmer. Just can't do it.
And lo, let me quote you some Ezekiel. And lo, thou art unto them as a very lovely song of one that hath a pleasant voice, and can play well on an instrument.
4 times.
For they hear thy words, but they do them not.
So that means what? Revolution. That means a bit more forceful imposition.
Come on. I mean, يعني il mezzo cammino di nostra via. I mean, come on. It's like no. We are not addressing the urgencies. And we are not. We are falling into a consensus around stuff. I blow the ram's horn. and say that what we saw yesterday with our plastic moon boots that we bought for 10 euros from China, walking through 3 feet of water in Venice, surrounded by what looked like winter stormtroopers off their cruise ship for a few hours in this sinking city.
Being documented every meter we went through iPhones and technologies and facial recognition systems.
Right? That we are on the precipice. We are on the precipice, and we have no consensus. That is other. We have no valid consensus. We are in need of a new religion. We are in need of prophets. And you will reply,
Beware.
that is an invitation. Beware
of false prophets.
Beware. I say the age of disenchantment has reached its apogee. That for all the Twitters and the Facebooks and these heraldic angels of this moment, we are at the very apex of an age of disenchantment. And we consume amnesia.
We live in amnesia. Amnesia is.
So
We'll come tomorrow and talk about amnesia. Anyhow, answer, Anthony.
Yeah, no, I mean, one thing that does come up about our time, and I wonder if it's different, and it's been talked about maybe since the Arab Spring, this idea of the leaderless movement as opposed to the leader,
good.
as opposed to the prophet, that there's some collective intelligence that's out there that can do certain things, but it kind of rises and falls, right? Like swarms. And I just wonder to what degree that's something we need to grapple with. I mean, to what degree is it necessary to have those figures, individuals? To what degree can these kind of larger bodies serve some kind of way of moving forward? I mean, right now, and maybe it's back to what we were talking about earlier. Some of the most impressive things has been just protests. Not much has been gained without constant protest, right? I mean, if we look back at gains, any gains, just laid on the table, what gains have just been granted? Oh, you want your rights? Oh, here you go. It usually comes with incredible persistence, right? And
The small font.
what's that?
It comes with small fonts. It comes with attachments. It comes with.
Well, it's seldom ever granted.
No, he's saying
It's-
violence.
yeah.
He's saying that it comes through violence.
Well, not necessarily violence. The civil rights movement wasn't necessarily violent. They achieved something. Violence was directed at it, but
For
it
sure.
didn't employ violence. It just persisted in its demand for something. And again, that collective demand. But again, oftentimes they were the leaders, right? Associated with that.
What was it, permission, again, in Italian?
The Upanishad?
How do you say permission?
Con permesso.
Con permesso. So, con permesso. So, if we talked about a prophecy as a change, as the will to change, as a vision, tamam? We talked about false prophets. We talked about prophets associated with religion. I think here at this moment in history, we have two interpretations of the prophecy. The prophecy by the scientist, the artist, which is the new prophet of our age. We don't need someone telling us about the day after, but we need someone to tell us how we can live in 20 years, how your children will grow up in this world. One. And the other sign of prophecy that Anthony was talking about, which we have seen all, is the protest movement as one, trying to change, two, trying to implement a vision, leaderless, yes, but incoherent, yes, has no poetry, yes, but a society completely becoming a prophet for itself, trying to usher a new day. And this is what we, again, to go back to the beginning, this is what we see in the protest movement today in Iraq, in Chile, in even in Venice, in Catalonia, and other places. It's a protest movement that is trying to achieve a prophecy of some sort. And that's, I think, very, very important, that we've moved away from the traditional religious kind of seer prophet into the scientist, the artist, and the protest movement.
Death.
بعد الشر, eh?
Death.
Eminent.
Death is today regarded by some as a disease.
Rather than the natural end to things.
A disease meaning can be cured. Much money, much thought is being invested into projects like Elon Musk's Neuralink. This brings us to this question of the transhumanists, whereby this fusion of technology and that was science fiction, a la William Gibson.
I think it still
today-
is science fiction.
It is still science fiction, but it is no longer something that you can call cyberpunk.
It's
no longer cyberpunk.
It's now tangible science fiction.
It's not cyberpunk. This is mainstream.
right.
This is, I'm talking to you about mainstream.
And is it more science fiction than what was being predicted, 50, 60, 80 years ago about where we'd be today? Maybe not.
No, I mean, going back to Brave New World or 1984 or these things. No, it's not. But today, this is I'm talking to you about a field of investment and a field of technological development. Now, it's really not very far away that I mean, maybe it's even happening. That couples, expectant couples, can say, well, there's an Alzheimer gene in my child. Let's snip that out. There's, actually, my child would be better if he had brown eyes than or blue eyes or green eyes than. No? I mean, these are options that are elite options, but that will increasingly become options.
And they're so scary that we still look at them as if they are, prophecies from the Old Testament of chariots of gods or something, because we cannot comprehend the impact of these things on our society. So we're still looking at these prophecies as...
Well, we've
They are
made
still
laws to make them
technology,
illegal,
right?
yeah.
It's still technology. Technology, in the phrase that technology is stuff that doesn't work. But from the moment that it works, it's no longer technology. It's
Something
it's
you
a
need.
reality.
Yeah.
It's a part of
Your existence.
the framework. So death is a disease. Is the contention of many. Now, we're already in an overpopulated world. We're already pushing the resources of the world to its very limits. That on top of that, we create longevity in the resource extraction paradigm. Leads us to a very difficult scenario, whereby there are those that can afford life, and there are those that can afford only shorter lives.
I mean, there's that, and access to that information, or let's say concerned, but for these concerns, aside from the environment, certainly, it doesn't affect the vast majority of people living on this planet. The vast majority of people living on this planet have to figure out how they make one meal extend into a second meal, how they
Get
live
water
from
resources
one day to next day, how they find water, how they find food, and that I think is probably the opposite spectrum of all of this. Is while we talk about moving forward, in fact, the vast majority of people are left behind.
So
And they're left in.
we have a two-stream future there, right? We have those that are going to live for 150 years and those that are going to live for 40. We return to we return to labor relations that are not extraneous or outside of the path of many human civilizations.
I mean, just a
relations.
basic premise.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add this as a line to what Sulayman is saying. We talk about death, and the few that want to extend their lives so that they can have more benefits of what they already have. But the vast majority, I think, in parts of the world, they wish for an early death. They want an end to the misery. They want an end to this kind of low level of existence. So I think that's a spectrum to speak about as well. I think if you were to offer a young boy in the slums of Bombay another 50 years to be poor and to be miserable and to have an empty stomach, I think he would
Make
tell
me
you.
poor and shoot me.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
he
I
would
was
say the
gonna say,
opposite.
the scenario is just the extremes, right? That's all it is. I mean, the extremes of one end of that spectrum of someone concerned about having the ability to not just do a facelift but live forever. You know, that's
But my question is: are we entering into a kind of techno-Roman empire where we have citizens and slaves? I mean, is that our future?
Worse than that, because your slaves won't be humans anymore. So you will be detached totally from the need to slave. So if we look at the Roman Empire, if you look at the Assyrian Empire, and all these empires that were built on slave power, they needed humans. So they're not slaves. They needed the slaves to be able to function to build these powers. But imagine this society you're describing will not need slaves anymore, because if they achieve this immortality you're talking about, they will also achieve AI and robotics to such an extent. One second. It will divorce them from the need to others. So it will create this absolute two-tier system between the elite, because always throughout the history, the elite always needed the masses, the labor, the thing, and that need created the conditions for revolutions to topple that elite.
Sure.
But imagine if you separate them.
And labor is no longer human.
Labor is no longer human.
So labor is not. So what do you do? Here's the question. This is what I want to provoke you.
Yes, sir.
In it. So you have those that have access to the Musk project, the Neuralink or its equivalent, who are the superhumans. You have the robots, or the automized workforce that even today cleans your house on remote control. What do you do with the remainder of the human population?
That is the reality.
But what do you do?
The reality will continue to live. They will suffer, but the reality exists with the remainder, not with that supreme semi-human beings with their
Popes.
robots.
So those you mean they are the popes of the story, and they live in their
And
own
the
world?
revolution will continue, sir.
it's interesting. In the 1960s, in fact, I was reading this not long ago, that one of the main narratives about robotics or artificial intelligence and the workplace was there was this narrative that as machines do more and more of the work, it would allow for us, the general population, to have more and more leisure.
Yeah.
And so there was this fantasy about leisure, and it was just left no further analysis, just inevitable mechanical kind of labor, and everyone would have leisure. And I think now we're arriving at a place, and I think it was just outlined that it's the opposite of leisure, right? It's an abandonment of the actual. Just to go with that narrative, that more and more of the workplace is going to be, taken over by kind of mechanics. There's no sign of leisure for anyone. It's either going to be those who have the kind of power to live forever, on the one hand, or those what would become of the useless person, right? It no longer has even the role of labor.
Well, he can consume, so hence the assault on sleep, 24/7, what have you. I mean, they can continue to be useful appendages of a network of consumption. But at the point where resources are finite and water is a source of conflict. What happens then to look? I mean, faceless death. Right, so let's say death is the disease. Death can be treated as they will have it, and then faceless death being what today is experienced in Yemen, what today is drones and so on, is the new phase
the
of
ultimate
warfare.
ultimate act of dehumanization. It's the ultimate act of differentiating between those that matter and those that don't matter. I mean, the 70s and 80s had this amazing term in economics, trickle-down economics. And I think the future is about trickle-down technology. It's about those that are privileged enough.
Trickle-down genetics.
Trickle-down genetics. Trickle-down humanity.
I disagree with both of you.
Good.
I think, well, look, I mean, we started talking about why a prophet comes into a society because a prophet, she recognizes a discrepancy in that society between the needs of the society and the projection of what's going on. So he prophesizes a change of course. Now, what you are talking about is definitely, allow me to prophesize, would definitely lead to a fundamental, revolution, upheaval, because that trickle-down economics didn't work, and that trickle-down technology is not working, will never work. So it will lead into a tiny aristocracy. What did you call it? Roman robotics? Robo-robot?
I don't know.
That aristocracy,
pockets of Caligulas.
Exactly. So that pockets of Caligulas would exist. And because they are separated from the masses, from the real masses, and there where you will have the upheavals, the revolutions, the thing that will attempt to topple that. That is the course of history. ثورة المسحوقين, the revolution of the oppressed, and it's always as inevitable as the day and night. I mean, this morning we were reading the signs of the end of times. This morning we're reading kind of when
Global commerce being one, very tall buildings, and
kind of
obscenity.
An obscenity
mean,
as a precursors for the re-emergence of the coming of the Christ, the re-emergence of the Mahdi, or whatnot, and it's always there's this fear, the fear of what we're going through, and we need the savior, we need the guide, we need something. But Caligulas never existed, could never prolong their...
Porn is a form of prophecy.
What is?
Porn.
Why is that?
Porn, as transgressive content, has always led technological development. So, if you look back at how do you remember Betamax? Betamax videos?
Betamax.
Yeah.
Betamax was essentially developed as a mode of distribution of porn. Development in photography was mostly led by the influx of revenue through the distribution of erotic photos. what today is pay as you go or whatever subscription websites, pioneered by porn.
But why is it prophecy?
No, I didn't say
It guarantees
Satisfaction.
profit.
I say,
Exactly.
I say it was. It's the vanguard of technological, of great technological development. But today, porn is omniscient. I mean, omniscient, omnipresent.
For
Porn
sure.
is porn is the it is it is a commodity of the era, and it's like the plastic boots we were wearing yesterday. It's everywhere.
A necessity.
A minor sign, in according to the coming of the hour.
Coming there.
The coming of the hour. A minor sign. No, it's just on the.
But let's talk about the artist as a prophet.
I think culture, arts and culture, and what its relationship is to.
That's the standard version of the artist, right? And it may be correct, but I'm just pointing out, it is the standard that the artist is the one who bears some message, brings something else. And I guess I just wonder about that more than anything else. Whether the artist still has that role. And that's being very generous to the artist, right?
Yeah. I think it still is.
Well, the basis of what they do or what artists do, I presume or I assume, is to be able to have a kind of detached view of everything that happens around them, whether it be for the purpose of beauty or whether it be for the purpose of thought, whether it be for the purpose of exposure of something. So to have the time to consider issues, which I think most artists fall into that description, as people with time to be able to consider the issues that are relevant. From that perspective, I think that, maybe there are not necessarily prophets, but they certainly are people who reveal contradictions, who work with contradiction, who work with the realities of the time, sometimes promoting it, sometimes, working against it. And let's not forget that the four of us sitting in this room are instigated through an art project. It is a project to put us together to think. It's a project that's put many other people together to think about issues that are relevant. So from that perspective, I think certainly it is an act, and it's a liberating act. It's an act of freedom in this context, which I think, okay, not to say that artists cannot be bound by the realities
Well,
of the world.
We spoke about the spaces for freedom, and whether there are any spaces that one can imagine for freedom. And I mean, I think that the role of art and literature in that is significant in terms of the possibility, the creation of the possibility of freedom. So just to go back to that Cocteau talks about himself as if he's colonized by a spirit, as if a spirit occupies him, that allows him to know parts of his being, and I think in that sense there is a space of great liberty beyond the idea of the sovereignty of the individual. Because the poet occupied by the muse is not sovereign. The poet occupied by the muse is occupied by the muse. The poet is part of a continuum that is not unrelated to his past, its past, her present, her future, and in fact is depossessed in a way. And now we return back to the idea of Babel, of divine Babel. What is the divine Babel? Is it inspired by the oleander leaves, the fumes of the oleander? that forced them into the divine state of the epilepsy. And there is a release. There is a release from the tyranny of individual sovereignty.
But is it, I mean, are we being entertained? Are we being distracted? Or are we being led to think? And if I could maybe turn that wonderful kind of magnetic glass that you've had on us for a couple of hours now, if I could turn it back on you, Sulayman, and I could ask you, as a director, as a writer, as a person who maybe more directly than any one of us creates art, creates time, creates. What do you have to say about what you do, and why do you do it? Why do you write? Why do you put on
I would
theatre?
add another line. As a theatre director, how do you prophesize the final product? How do you see it happening? Do you see it in your head? Do you have a vision? Tell us.
What's
For me,
relevant for you?
theatre is parallel time. It's a parallel. It's the opportunity to create a parallel time. A little bit like this bunker puts us in a parallel time. It's an opening to a pluriverse, to a plurality. That I mean, we haven't discussed the roles of shamans and mind-altering drugs and those elements of prophecy that allow for the connection with parallel things. Most of our talk has been based on a linear thinking about futures, about presence, past, presence, and futures. And so, I mean, theatre in its rapacious ephemerality. It relates to the ephemeral with the relation of a lover. It is rapacious for the ephemeral, for the coordinate, the time-space coordinate that is the moment of performance.
And the content? What drives the content?
The content is driven, in my case, is driven by a desire to also engage other so let's say realities, civilizational histories, texts. I mean, I'm engaged in a cycle of reworking antique texts at this moment. Texts from Sumar, Ratha لمدينة Ur, the lamentation for the first city. The lamentation for the destruction of the city of Ur was a project that struck a text. Actually, it was a text. It's the first lamentation for the idea of a civic entity that was destroyed by, for unknown reasons, or by climate change, or by a tsunami, or by an invading army, and destroyed 2 times, in fact. Once by natural catastrophe, then again by the axes of the Elamites. And so,
in your selection of that,
but that those broken remnants of past civilizations that are inevitably fractured, that are inevitably incomplete, and in their beauty they coalesce. Their beauty coalesces in their incompleteness.
So basically, it's a double prophecy. So an artist 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, wrote a lamentation that was the
Or a
artist,
priest.
or a priest kind of wrote a lamentation which was a vision to something that had happened, and then you come later I don't know how many thousands of years.
And use it as an echo box for Syria today, for Europe today.
Fascinating, fascinating. So that's kind of the artist as a prophet to what is happening and what's going to happen.
Or the reconstitution of a ripped drum. You know, drums are beautiful objects. They need a certain shape, and they need a frame, and they need a certain depth to be able to create echoes and to be able to do their function, which is the most basic function of percussion, of rhythm, right? And in a way, the work on these antique texts is about kind of creating new drums somehow.
So it's not so different from, for example, what I do, which is to look into our past and to find moments that are relevant for our present and our future, whatever they may be, however they may be reinterpreted. So from that perspective, I would say that you and I are not so different in what we do.
I think both of you are the poets of the tribe. The only prophet here is Anthony. Because he is the person who is always talking about what will happen in the future. Both of you are like the seers of a tribe, the poets, the drummers of a tribe.
طقاقة يعني احنا طقاقة.
الطقاقة مال العشيرة. He is the أنت نبي.
Anthony, take over. Come on. Come on. Tell us.
Because, you know, seriously, now, apart from joking, I see reality as it is, and I write it. Ajmal goes back into history in the past and reconstructs a window sill and a wall to achieve. Sulayman al-Sha'ar, reminds us and tell us. He could be a prophet. He's very close to a prophet, but poets have always been
Liars.
like Cretans. But Suleiman takes the reality and turn it into a performance, a function into the future, leads us into the future. Amongst us, you're the only person who deals with science and who deals with the impact of a certain event on a society and how will that transform into the future.
That's true. I mean,
The humbleness.
It means in terms of current research for sure, and looking at this kind of phenomenon of the floating cities, floating architecture. But again, it's based on a kind of reaction more than some vision. It's a reaction to certain circumstances, and it's an inevitable move
But
forward.
accepting the inevitable, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is some moving forward without a doubt.
So as the prophet amongst us here, as the designated prophet amongst us here,
And it's about time.
Tell us about the next 10 years. How can we are desperate for a prophet. We're desperate for a savior. Tell us for the next 10 years, what do we do for these floating cities? Because apart from Ajmal, who's lucky not to have a sea close to him, we all live very close to the sea.
I refuse to play the role of the prophet.
Which is what exactly a good prophet would do. So let's get beyond that. Keep going.
Yeah. No, I mean, I actually think what's most interesting, and it's back to this kind of collective, in architecture, not the old versions of architecture, not these notions of visions, but right now this kind of collective energy that I'm picking up in Vietnam, that I'm picking up in Bangladesh, that I'm picking up all around the world of these efforts. For me, it's been a matter of trying to connect the dots more than anything else, trying to find a kind of collective intelligence in how people are actually responding to sea level rise. And I think it's back to this kind of collectiveness. In fact, my role in this project has really been to connect the dots and put people in touch with each other. For example, saying, do you realize what's going on here? And most of us, we're all in our own little silos, right? But the ability to be able to connect dots around the planet just from doing the research has opened up a whole new strategy, right? And now it's saying, okay, this was successful. What if we added this to this? Can we take it to the next level? And this is all based on existing and experimental knowledge that's actually going on at the moment. And I actually think that's one of the only ways I see as to move forward. It's not even starting from scratch. It's starting from what is actually working and keep advancing it.
But prophets always connected the dots.
Yeah.
All the prophets of ancient times, they always connected the dots and moved forward.
Well, there's the thesis, there's the antithesis, which is those that refuse the hypothesis or the thesis and say, no, this is not the way to do it. And then there's that category of people that move beyond that and say, look, if this is the reality, if this is where we're headed, if this is the future, here's how we need to live it, here's how we need to address it, here's how we need to make it more sustainable, here's how we need to make it more equitable, more humane.
And what's interesting to me about it is that there is extraordinary innovation that gives us a completely different view of how to move forward. But I don't think it's necessarily coming from someone's intention to offer a vision. The vision is almost a collective intelligence that demonstrates how to move forward more than a proclamation of what needs to be done or something like this.
Which is interesting.
Sacred disease? Meaning...
Running out of time.
Meaning the sacred disease has descended upon us.
There's little doubt of that.
Too little time.
I mean, in fact, I don't know if you guys saw this, but literally last week there were new maps that were revealed to the world. Did y'all see that? Published in scientific journals that the sea level rise that they thought was going to be, in fact, they've almost. It's now demonstrated that they were far, far off. It's going to be much, much worse. So now territories of the globe that we thought would be affected like this are now being affected this much. So the predictions, if you will, are much, much greater than we even imagined. And it's at a point that it's not just overwhelming. There's no, even in terms of like cities, even if they wanted to react, how do you? Most cities don't even have a budget to react to. Even if they had a plan, they don't have a budget to implement that.
You see, this is just to see that, I mean, those are the stakes. You speak about the stakes and what we discussed earlier as being, I mean, look, it's all a little bit leftist and consensual, what we're discussing. So, I have to say, because
I should not sit in a council of leftists.
No, the council of leftists is convened because what you described there just now leads to paradigm change. And
radical.
And in that moment, I will say, comes the possibility of the new religion or that possibility, because at that moment in time, radical action becomes neither an option nor a luxury. It becomes a necessity. And the radical action takes place across the spectrum. From those that will say, we want none of you, and those that will say, we need this earth.
All of you.
With or without you.
But all predictions are, and us knowing what we know, what they say is that there would have to be radical change across the board in the imminent future to stave off that future. And whether that type of radical change, from all the messages and from all the U.S. is pulling out of the Paris Environment Accords very soon, that will become a reality. Others will follow suit. I highly doubt that the radical change the will, the fortitude for that radical change exists at those levels. So what it means is that reality that scientists are so, well, it's a hypothesis. Let's make it a reality, whether it's in 50 years or in 30 years or 40 years, whether it's a 2-meter rise or a 1.5-meter rise, whatever the data references, is inevitable. And with it, geographies and territories will change. With it, the mix that exists today will be very different. You've got, I don't know, 100 and something million in Bangladesh that will be beneath water. Unless they learn very quickly how to survive above water, they're going to have to move to a different area. They're going to have to move maybe west into India, or maybe north, or maybe completely be taken elsewhere. Parts of the world that were never occupiable, territories that were never sustainable, will have to become sustainable to address that. Large amounts of humanity will perish, or not.
You know, there's an interesting tension. In Bangladesh, there were many farmers, and even landless farmers, and in any case, the idea of the landless farmer, I actually think, is quite interesting, because with the floods that have started to happen in Bangladesh, there are all these farmers who have adapted to floating farms and have adapted to actually producing with the floating farms. And with that comes this notion, what does it, this idea of no longer requiring land and being able to be a farmer opens up a whole new territory, right?
Whitman. And should we end with Whitman? Whoever degrades another degrades me. Whatever is done or said returns at last to me. Through me the afflatus surging and surging. Through me the current and index.